Hello, my name is Irene Parker. I'm the Engagement, Education and Prevention Manager at the Victorian Ombudsman's Office. Welcome to the first in our Behind the Scenes series, and we would like to welcome you all to this in the first of our Behind the Scenes series. We'll start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Victoria and by acknowledging their connections to community and to culture. We also acknowledge that this week is Reconciliation Week and extend our welcome to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be joining us today. We're beaming in from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So we're launching our Behind the Scenes webinar series with a look at the investigation process. With that, let's meet our panellists. In a rare combination, we have with us today the Victorian Ombudsman, Deborah Glass. Deborah has been the Victorian Ombudsman for 9 years, a lawyer. She was raised in Victoria before working overseas, after which she worked overseas in regulatory and oversight roles. She returned to Melbourne in 2014 to take up the role of Victorian Ombudsman. To Deborah's right is the Victorian Deputy Ombudsman, Megan Philpot. Megan has worked mainly as a lawyer in the public sector and has been the Victorian Deputy Ombudsman since 2015. Her responsibilities are managing complaint handling and investigations at the Ombudsman's Office. Ros Wozniak is the Director of Investigations, and she is a former New South Wales Police Force Detective Senior Sergeant and has spent 25 years working in investigations and operations management. She's worked both across the public and private sectors. Thank you for joining us today. I'll make one final point before we start, and that is to say that the purpose of today is to cover the investigation process as broadly as possible. If anyone requires specific details about any of the discussion points, please get in contact with our office directly. Otherwise, use the Q&A function if you'd like to pose some questions to us. So welcome to behind the scenes of an investigation at the Victorian Ombudsman's Office. Deborah, what do you mean by investigation?
Well, good question. It's not what people always think it is. So, people might say, well, I've made a complaint to the Ombudsman and the Ombudsman is going to investigate my complaint. If we look at the numbers, we get about 20,000 jurisdictional complaints in a year. Out of those, we conduct something over 5,000 what we call the formal inquiries, ways in which we seek to resolve a complaint. And we also conduct a very small number of formal investigations. If we look at our last financial year, the number was 31. So what we're talking about today are the formal investigations, the ones where I'm using and my staff are using my delegated Royal Commission powers. If you want to hear more about how we deal with complaints and use the inquiries powers, come along on Thursday where we're going to be having another webinar on that subject.
Thank you for that, Spruik. Megan, the Ombudsman can conduct different types of investigations. Can you take us through those, please?
There are about 4 different types of investigations, you might say, Irene, but all use the same powers under the Ombudsman's legislation that's delegated to her staff. So the 4 different types really come to us from a complaint, a single complaint. For example, a complaint about council's use of a waste management levy. That might lead, in fact, it did lead on one occasion to an investigation. There are also complaints we receive, for example, about kinship care and funding of kinship care or delay in payments. That resulted in the investigation. Charges by Ambulance Victoria, a single complaint that's made to us, which will result in an investigation and various findings. The other kind of investigation we do is what we call an own motion investigation. So the Ombudsman's Office might receive a number of complaints about a single or similar issue, such as public housing complaints or complaints from residents of community housing. So we bundled them together, for example, and conducted an own motion investigation, a systemic concern, if you like. Also, own motion investigations can come out of concerns expressed within the community. For example, the EPA and its apparent failure to consult very well with the community in disposing its soil in relation to the Westgate Tunnel project. So that's an own motion investigation, a systemic concern, if you like. The third type of investigation is a public interest complaint that we will receive from the Anti-Corruption Commission, IBAC. We commonly call them a whistleblower complaint. So we will receive those from IBAC. We're obliged to investigate, except the Ombudsman does have a discretion in certain circumstances not to investigate. I won't go into those, obviously. So those kinds of complaints, for example, might be a common one is nepotism or misuse of a corporate card. We've tabled several reports in relation to those sorts of matters involving council staff or members of the state public sector. Lastly, there's a parliamentary referral, which has really gained momentum during this Ombudsman's term, it would seem. And that's where the two houses or a single house or a committee of one of the Houses of Parliament can refer an investigation to the Ombudsman. The red shirts investigation is a classic, maybe, that's often cited in the media. And that was to do with party politics using using public funds for party political purposes. Another one was Operation Watts as well, where we joined forces, as it were, with IBAC to investigate matters relating to branch stacking in the Labor Party. So they're the kinds of investigation. I will mention, though, that in particular, the last kind of investigation, the Ombudsman has no discretion not to investigate. She must investigate, and she must investigate forthwith. As I said, though, all the exercise of powers are the same, and they result in findings and possible recommendations.
Your mention of discretion leads nicely into the next question I have to you, Ombudsman, and that is, it's understood that your work is highly discretionary in terms of what you investigate and how. And sometimes you announce an investigation and sometimes it remains confidential. Can you talk us through how you decide when to investigate a matter and when you decide to publicise it?
Well, it's not actually as discretionary as all that. And as Megan has indicated, there are some key circumstances where I have no effective discretion. If Parliament refers something to me, I must investigate it. If IBAC refers a whistleblower type case to me, I must do something at least with it, with some form of investigation into the allegations. So those are matters that I have no choice about, although obviously how I do it is a matter for me, and I know Ross is going to talk a bit about how we do those in a moment. But in terms of what I announce and what I don't, public interest complaints, whistleblower cases are conducted in private. They must be. They're not announced, and many of them will never appear in the public domain. They are simply conducted in private. The systemic investigations really are the ones where my discretion comes into effect, because there are so many issues, out there in public sector land, and every ombudsman office has limited resources. Mine is no exception. So we really do need to, we go through a fairly targeted process of identifying, how we use our limited resources to best effect. So looking at patterns of complaints, for example, that will determine what is an appropriate theme for the office. And so when I make those decisions, for example, public housing, as Megan has mentioned. I will announce that because I want the public to know we're doing this, and I'm inviting submissions because they are helpful to the investigation. They give us a richer evidence base. So it is a mixed picture. A lot is carried out in private, a small number of investigations, essentially those that are systemic of emotion, will be announced, and they're the ones that I'll be looking for people to come to us on and assist the investigation.
Okay. Well, Ros, your name has been mentioned. So can you please tell us what happens at the start of an investigation?
Yes, sure. It can vary a little bit depending on the type of investigation, but I think I'll use the public interest disclosure scheme or PIC or whistleblower investigation to illustrate what might occur. So VO receives quite defined allegations in PIC investigations from the IMAC. And so it's quite clear what it is that we're looking into from the outset. So, for example, a typical matter might be allegations of improper recruitment practices in a public authority. So what we might start with is inquiries regarding recruitment packs or other documentation to satisfy ourselves whether on the face of things at that point the allegations there's information, that tends to show that improper conduct has occurred. Oftentimes, what happens at that point in the process is we might find that there isn't any evidence of improper conduct. There's the appropriate documentation there, that the practice seems sound and in accordance with the authority's policies and procedures and public expectations, and we might seek to discontinue at that particular point in time. And obviously, that would be a conversation with the Deputy Ombudsman and the Ombudsman about how that matter's progressing. If the matter on the face of things at that point of evidence gathering does tend to show that there is further to look into, then we would engage with our investigation planning processes and determine resourcing and methodologies and so forth from there.
Well, I know the Ombudsman has quite extraordinary powers and can obtain information from any person in any way she sees fit. On a practical level, can you talk us through the processes you follow and those key decision points about using which powers and when?
Yeah, sure. So continuing with the analogy of the PIC investigation, and probably just a general statement here for all of our investigations, is we only use coercive powers if and when necessary. Our preference is to inquirers to, voluntary appearances and those sorts of things first. But then if we consider that voluntary cooperation is unlikely, or there's a risk of, a breach of confidentiality or loss of evidence, for example, we may engage our coercive powers at that point. And those decisions are made in direct consultation, or they're made by, but in direct consultation with the Ombudsman herself. So, for example, we may issue a summons for documentation pertaining to allegations in a PIC investigation. Sometimes those requests are quite voluminous. Sometimes in consultation with our contact points in authorities, we've discovered that people draw a little bit of comfort from the issuance of a summons to assist them in their role and in exactly what to provide us for our investigation. We may also summons people to appear before us for an interview or coercive interview, where they must answer the questions that we put to them. Or in certain circumstances, like I mentioned before, we may be concerned about the confidentiality involved in a set of circumstances. We may issue parties with confidentiality notices, and that restricts certain categories of people being communicated with about our investigation. But we're very mindful in those circumstances to also consider what categories of people are appropriate for a person to seek support from or communicate their needs in our investigation with. We also do, in very rare circumstances, conduct site inspections for certain types of investigations as well.
A couple of things have come up there. Can you talk about some of the reasonable adjustments that you might make for people if they're called to interview?
Yeah, certainly. So when we communicate with people about a summons, obviously there is a date and time that the appearance is set down for, but that is not fixed in stone. So we communicate with people about their needs, and you know, those needs might include legal representation, support people, other personal circumstances that we need to consider. And it's quite a common occurrence for interviews or return of documentation to be considered for extension. And that's something that we do on a case-by-case basis and with welfare at the centre.
We've talked about people being called for interview. We've talked about whistleblowers. Deborah, what's your approach to witness welfare?
This has been an issue for me since I came into the role, actually. When I first started as Ombudsman, I got quite a bit of feedback from people in the public sector that the Ombudsman's office had a reputation for being pretty scary. That, you know, that investigations were very challenging, very intimidating, and that people felt, you know, damaged by them. So it's not for me to, you know, judge the whys and wherefores of that. But what I was very determined to do in my capacity as Ombudsman is ensure that this is front and centre of how we do our work. So witness welfare really is about, for me, it's about proportionate investigation. It's about, you know, if we want to talk to somebody, it's about thinking, you know, Roz has indicated before, we have, you know, how do we use those powers? Do we need to use those powers? So it is about coming up with ways of obtaining evidence that take into account not only the needs of the investigation, but the needs of the individual we're dealing with. And not everybody is a subject. So it's very conscious of the fact that some of the allegations we get might be vexatious. They might be, you know, without foundation. And when we dig into them, we might find that. So we don't want to just, you know, come in with, you know, full-size jackboots simply because we're dealing with an allegation. We need to be able to engage proportionately with that, do that initial work, and make sure when those powers are used, if those powers are used, they are used appropriately and proportionately. So witness welfare for me isn't about, you know, sort of tea and biscuits at an interview. It is actually about conducting a proportionate investigation that is sensitive to the needs of the people we engage with. And those people may be potential witnesses, they may be disclosers, they may be subjects. Anybody can be caught up in this, but whoever they are, we are and we will be sensitive to their needs.
So, Roz, how do you ensure VO investigations are procedurally fair?
Yeah, Irene, we've woven the principles of procedural fairness right through our investigation procedures, and it starts with the first conversation with an involved party. I think your clear communication and information about our process starts the ball rolling in terms of a person, you know, getting that sense of fairness of contact with our office. I spoke before about the fact that we make reasonable adjustments. I think that's sort of part of that fairness piece as well. But we do have a process for formal engagement in a procedural fairness sense, and that is generally at our report drafting phase. So say, for example, we have conducted our investigation in large part. The investigation is still open, but it's in the draft reporting stage. We've made preliminary findings, for example, about, you know, particular allegations, and we would present those findings, and particularly any information that might be considered adverse to a person's interest, or if we want to fact check with a person, we provide them with extracts of that draft report to let them know what it is that we at the moment are indicating the findings of our investigation. And we invite their response. We consider that response fairly and equitably, and we set that out in our draft report, and we change findings if necessary.
Megan, you've mentioned IBAC. You've also mentioned Operation Watts. It can be confusing to know who can investigate what. How do you work with other oversight and integrity agencies?
That's a very good question, Irene. Well, I'm pleased to say we're not the Star Chamber anymore. We do have powers to share information, and this is really at the heart of things. There's a bit of a proliferation of oversight agencies across this country, in my personal view, but nonetheless, the Ombudsman has an extremely broad remit. Under certain circumstances, Deborah can look into even corrupt conduct if it's referred from IBAC, as well as a single complaint from a member of the community. So with that broad remit, it's often that our broad remit will overlap with other oversight agencies, such as IBAC, such as, for example, a classic is the Local Government Inspectorate. So we might receive a complaint, IBAC might receive a complaint, the Local Government Inspectorate might receive a complaint, all about the same issue, possibly addressed in different terms or not. And so each of us might be able to investigate either the same matter or part of the complaint. So using our information sharing powers and just decent good communication skills, we regularly meet with other oversight agencies when we receive matters, and we are able to share that information. And we will decide which is maybe the appropriate body, or maybe the legislation ultimately is the decider of that. So in Operation Watts, for example, the Ombudsman received a referral from Parliament. IBAC, I understand, received complaints from many different areas, MPs, the Parliament, and a whistleblower as well. That's publicly known. And so we decided that we would conduct a joint investigation, or the Ombudsman and the Commissioner did. And so we seconded 3 staff and funded a writer as well to contribute to that investigation. Our staff and the writer were sworn in as IBAC officers and lived over there as well physically, or as best they could during COVID. And we met every week, sometimes every 2 weeks, as a steering committee around that investigation. And the final product was indeed a joint report.
And that investigation was ultimately tabled, wasn't it?
It
thereby
was.
making it public.
Yes.
And so, Deborah, you can table your investigation reports to Parliament, and as I've said, thereby effectively making them available publicly. How do you decide which to table?
But it comes down to the public interest. If I go back to the numbers, 20,000 complaints a year, many thousands of inquiries, some dozens of formal investigations, I probably table on average 10 reports a year. And that includes casebooks with practice guides, so they're not all investigations. So you can already see from that my tabled public work is a tiny percentage of the work the office actually does. So I apply a public interest lens to that. I'm looking to see what does the public, what is it important for me to communicate to the public. So that will usually be the big systemic investigations. And clearly, if I've announced something, I'm going to table a report in Parliament. Public housing, workers' compensation. I mean, there are 2 or 3 of these every year, and they're all tabled in Parliament. What I'm looking at as well is, is there a lesson here for somebody else? So Megan, I think, has mentioned a couple of other. Sometimes with the complaint investigations we do, where a single complaint can result in a report tabled in Parliament. Financial hardship, we receive complaints about the way local councils deal with financial hardship. We looked into some of those. We conducted an investigation thematically into that. And and it was really important that we communicate that practice across the public sector, because there are things that everybody can learn.
So how do you ensure that your investigations achieve change?
It's about getting the recommendations right, taking the agency with you. So I think that is really important, and we work pretty hard at that around the end of that investigation. We sometimes the findings can be quite hard to swallow. It's difficult to listen to criticism at times, and it's really important, I think, for us to be constructive in the way we communicate that, and for the agencies we engage with not to be defensive in their response. I'm thinking about investigation we did some years ago to state trustees, where we had received a large number of complaints about state trustees, pretty vulnerable people, who were very affected by the operations of state trustees. We engaged with the agency, and it was challenging at first, but during the investigation, the level of cooperation increased significantly. And certainly at the end, when we were discussing the findings, which were difficult, I think, for the organisation, there was a real level of acceptance by them that there were some serious problems that needed to be fixed. And we engaged with them on what recommendations, what would fix them, So it's important to ensure that recommendations are operationally sound. They're not just sort of pie in the sky thoughts by the Ombudsman about, things that might work. We need to really have a strong sense of what the agency can achieve. Because if they don't own the problem, then that's not going to achieve good public administration. It's not going to achieve those improvements that we want to see.
Okay, and with respect to recommendations, it's about ownership, it's about agency being able to operationalise
Yes.
even. But the take-up rate of the recommendations that you make,
it's very high. I mean, historically, I think pretty much throughout my term, it's been well over 90%. It's and what is important to recommendations are not something where you tick the box, okay, but we actually don't make a lot of recommendations. We rarely make more than a handful of recommendations, even in these really big systemic investigation reports, because we want to ensure that they're sound, they're operationally sensible, and we'll monitor them, and I do monitor them. So we will table a report every couple of years, looking back at the recommendations made in previous reports, what has actually happened since, have they made a difference?
We've got an opportunity to take some questions from the floor. So I'll start with you, Deborah. What triggers a complaint being raised to an investigation?
Well, it's a question we've already touched on, but it's probably useful to perhaps give some specific examples. So, Ambulance Victoria, I think you mentioned this one earlier, Megan, we received a complaint from somebody who was charged $519, I think it was, some years ago, by Ambulance Victoria for treatment without transport, as it was known. So he'd been injured, somebody else had called the ambulance. Outside the pub, I don't remember exactly the details, but the ambulance turns up, he's basically fine, says, don't need your assistance, but he receives a bill. And he complained to Ambulance Victoria, and they said, our policy is treatment without transport. That's what it costs. So he complained to us. So we began investigating this as an individual complaint, and then began expanding that into understanding Ambulance Victoria's policies, what were the issues here. And we found out in the course of this that this is a regular practice where people are charged. Again, to Ambulance Victoria's credit, they engaged very, very positively with us during the investigation, and they agreed, in fact, to change their policies here. So going back to your question, when would a single complaint result in a investigation and a report tabled in Parliament when it involves, by and large, a systemic issue that affects a large number of people.
Okay, thank you. Megan, how do you incorporate good practice of agencies you investigate into your final reports?
Very good question. As I said before, we're not in the Star Chamber days. And I think a modern day ombudsman's role is to acknowledge the good work done by organisations, as well as finding problematic spots in public administration. And in fact, the ombudsman legislation across the country now has changed, and Victoria's no exception, to say that one of the objectives of the Ombudsman is to improve public administration. And going along with what Deborah was saying about you've got to take the agencies, you've got to bring them along to own the issue if improvement or change is going to happen. We engage with the agencies very closely along an investigation, particularly a systemic one. Very often, if our engagement is successful, shall we say, the agency might change its processes during the investigation, and we will acknowledge that in our final report on the investigation. So they might be prompted by the investigation to do that, or they'll take it up on their own initiative. I think a good example there is the Ombudsman's recent publication of complaint handling in a crisis, where we looked at 4 organisations caught up in COVID, as it were, who had to really respond very quickly to complaints from the public about the impact of COVID and how it was affecting them. For example, the quarantine services offered by the government. It was Business Victoria as well as state revenue, for example. And in that, the publication of that report, we put it down to 12 lessons that agencies learned along the way, and we did too, as an Ombudsman office along the way. And in that report, we recognise indeed the good work that organisations had engaged in to try and accommodate the concerns of the community around battling through COVID.
Let me just add to that, Irene. One of the things, local councils, of course, are in my jurisdiction, and there are 79 of them. So, when it comes to practices, we usually find when we look into local council activities that there is a broad range of practices, from some really dreadful to some really fabulous. And one of the things that is so important, I think, for the office to do with the systemic investigations, particularly those involving local council, is to draw out that good practice. But I remember in the financial hardship investigation that I mentioned earlier, we saw some really excellent hardship policies that some councils had already introduced. So referencing those in the investigation and then giving other councils a chance to say, oh, that's what they're doing over there. Well, that's something I can learn from. It doesn't need to come from our office. It's about putting it out there so that agencies can see for themselves what good practice looks like.
Ros, I have one for you. What are those recent internal, external investigations challenges? How have they been addressed?
Question, Irene. I think, Deborah in particular has mentioned, proportionality and public interest several times during our chat today. And I'd probably start there. So it's a challenge that all investigators share, and that is the efficiency versus thoroughness or interest a conundrum, really. And what we've done about that in recent years is we've introduced more of a project management methodology focus. So the use of, specific timelines and decision points in investigations. And we've got a little way to go to distill that a bit further, but we're encouraging our investigators to be quite discerning and efficient in their practices and getting to the nub of issues much more quickly than, potentially previous investigations. And so, yeah, there's room to do more in that space. So that's the first challenge I'd like to mention. Then a second one, I think, is the ever-changing landscape that we work within. We have a very broad jurisdiction. So there's often some weird and wonderful subject matter to get across. Megan mentioned the EPA investigation that we did a couple of years ago earlier, and I remember a few of our investigators finding out things about soil waste that they never thought that they would find out about. Part of the landscape change that I'd like to point out in particular is technological advances as well. We've got to remain astute and alive to better practices in that space. So we have a lot of tools at our disposal, but we're always looking at improving ways and keeping up to date with our training in what's going on around the world.
It sounds like you have a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario when you're striking the balance between thoroughness versus timelines. So in terms of qualifications and whatnot, a question from the floor has been, what kind of qualifications do those working at the VO hold? What background might someone have?
There are various in my team. So there are some of us, myself included, as you mentioned earlier, from a policing background. Many of our people have degrees in law or other qualifications in social sciences, for example. Some of our people have qualifications in information technology. Some have either qualifications or backgrounds in understanding financial records or intelligence analysis. And then we have a couple of very wonderful resources in our team that concern themselves with our report editing and the like. So it's quite a broad range, and I think it's probably less about what someone's qualifications and experience is to date. It's more about whether they have an inquiring mind and an alignment to our values and a willingness to learn. I think that's really important too.
I'll just add there, Irene, there are some people who don't have formal qualifications and they are treasures within the office because they're smart, they're curious, as you say, and always on top of their game, very creative in thinking about solutions.
Well, I'll throw to you, Megan. Is there a support fund for legal advice or expenses to help even the playing field to get a successful complaint heard?
Well, far be it from me as a lawyer to disparage my brethren, but actually people don't need to be represented by a lawyer to come to the Ombudsman's office. And in fact, we discourage it, particularly when a complainant might be a fee-paying client to a lawyer. We don't have a fund as such. We certainly provide for witness welfare and counselling if need be, but no, we don't have a legal fund, and I encourage anyone to come to the office without a lawyer. And we would ensure that there's an equal playing field as best we may during the conduct of an inquiry or an investigation.
I would just add to that, and I agree with all of that, Megan. When we look at the Ombudsman in comparison with the courts, one of the points that we make regularly is the Ombudsman provides a free service. You don't need to have a lawyer, you don't need to be a lawyer to come to the Ombudsman. And it's really important for the staff to be able to distill the kinds of complaints that come to us into language that anybody can understand. You shouldn't need to have that kind of support to be able to engage our services. And that's where it does contrast with other parts of the broader legal system, where you feel as though it will not be an equal playing field unless you have a lawyer.
Yes.
Is a genuine and real assessment of human rights undertaken before deciding whether or not to investigate a complaint?
Absolutely, it is. It's actually embedded within our case management system and our policy making system as well. The Ombudsman, I mean, really has to be the model exemplar in all this, given that she has the powers to investigate and make inquiries into what I'll loosely call breaches of human rights under our Charter of Rights and Responsibilities legislation. But yes, it's embedded in our system. A human rights assessment is also undertaken before we issue a summons, and that's detailed, and many steps in the processes, yes. It's not just a cursory look.
And I think it's really important to stress, as Victoria's human rights investigator, that human rights is absolutely not a box to be ticked, not in this office, not anywhere. And what we look at when we look at agencies' human rights assessments is exactly that. Make sure that it's dealt with in a profound and meaningful way, because it needs to be embedded in practices, as opposed to something that we just, tick off out there to say, oh, we've done the human rights thing.
There's another question from the floor, and I'll open it up to all of you. Where are the best resources to understand and implement best practice investigation practice methods?
I might just start with a comment, and then, of course, Ros and Deborah, you have your thoughts as well. It depends what kind of investigation you're conducting. An ombudsman investigation is quite unique in the sense that it is sometimes an ombudsman might fault, but it's also getting the best outcome, the best resolution, and what's in the public interest. So you're not gathering evidence for a brief of evidence all the time at all. If anything, we might do that in a public interest disclosure investigation. So I would say it depends what kind of investigation training you're looking at. Certainly, I know the government offers the Certificate 4. That's more of an evidence gathering approach to investigation, which might result in legal proceedings, but it's probably a good start. But when you come into the Ombudsman's office, we seek to disabuse people of that and always think creatively, constructively, and what outcome do we want here?
Yeah, thanks, Megan, for that prompt. I agree. A Cert 4 in government investigations can give somebody some good education in that space. But in terms of resources that are readily available, I might do a small plug for our friends at IBAC. They've produced some resourcing that's available on their website about government investigations and advice for or government authorities that are conducting their own internal investigations, which is sometimes a point of intersection between our office and government authorities. They may conduct elements of an investigation sort of with us along for the ride as we keep an investigation open, for example. So there are some ready resources out there, but I quite agree with Megan's comment of understanding the landscape in which you're operating, the frameworks, the thresholds for evidence, and the standard of proof required in the investigation that you're conducting, and advise yourself accordingly.
Did you want to add to that, Deborah?
I defer to my Director of Investigations when it comes to where to find the best resources in anything.
In order to undertake an investigation, one needs a delegation. Can you please explain what a delegation is and who can have one?
Well, I might defer to my, but in broad terms, the powers are mine. They are the Ombudsman's powers, and they are delegated as appropriate within the office. So My deputy, I think, has all of my delegated powers except the power to delegate. Although, as a matter of practice, as I mentioned earlier, I remain deeply involved in the individual decision to use coercive powers, and the decision, that they are my decisions. I sign the summons, I sign the notice, I ask the questions as to whether this is necessary, and sometimes I say, no, sorry, I'm not willing to do this. So delegations are obviously a series of levels depending on the powers and functions we're talking about. And perhaps Megan would like to expand a little further on that.
Certainly, what I can think of is our frontline people who pick up the phone and try and resolve a complaint on the phone after picking up the phone, which is quite unusual in complaint handling organisations. So Deborah has augmented her powers of delegation, or augmented the delegations, I should say, to our frontline staff. So they're at a VPS 4, sometimes at a VPS 5 level. So they are equipped to pick up the phone, make jurisdictional decisions as to whether or not we can assist people, and also to resolve complaints. So they're quite high delegations. In Roz's team, and I'll hand over to Roz in a minute, she has senior investigators who have the power, for example, to share information with other agencies that maybe the frontline people, for example, don't have. Such a tricky question there. So I think the general view amongst the sector when they find out about this is that we have quite high delegations. Deborah's very generous with her powers, but of course we keep each other in check with pretty strict quality assurance mechanisms in place. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I would agree with those comments. And, I think with delegations come significant responsibility, and we do keep each other in check by, aligning ourselves to the delegations that we have and checking in about the decisions that we make. And, in my team, for example, I have principal investigators that work with my investigators and senior investigators to double check the decisions that they're making before we sort of progress those items to where it is that they're heading. Information sharing, for example, as well.
Just on that, Roz, it strikes me that it might be worth just saying a few words about our quality assurance processes and investigations, because I think people could reasonably be wondering, how do you ensure that everything is as clear and proportionate and efficient and effective as I hope we're articulating. And of course, like any organisation, the Ombudsman organisation, you have reasonable turnover within. It's a small organisation. There are limited opportunities for promotion in an organisation like this, and that's inevitable. So there's always a high degree of training of new starters, and quality assurance is something that is very dear, I know, to my deputy's heart, certainly dear to mine. And I hope dear to all of our leaders. So I think that's probably worth just saying a bit about as well.
Yeah, certainly. So quality assurance, it has a number of heads to that in our organisation. Megan mentioned our case management system earlier. We have workflows that assist people to understand the elements that are required to be done as they progress through the various forms of investigation that we do. Some of those points in a workflow require the import or authorisation from a principal investigator or myself, or indeed even the deputy or the ombudsman herself at points in time. So that's the sort of forward process. And then we have, I guess, a backwards looking process as well, where we dip sample, elements of our investigations. Principal investigators and I undertake that process and report on that process on a quarterly basis. And we complete sort of a 360-degree loop with picking up on elements that may need a little bit of an uplift or a little bit of an adjustment, and we deliver training around those items as well.
Here's another question. Do you often have complaints that come from IBAC, and out of both your groups, who would lead the investigation? Is it dependent on the topic? And what topics do IBAC lead, and what investigations does the Ombudsman's team?
The short answer is it depends. We get a lot of complaints referred from IBAC. IBAC basically, when it comes to whistleblower matters, the public interest disclosures and complaints, IBAC is the clearinghouse. So they're the ones who determine whether something is or is not a public interest complaint. So they may determine it to be a public interest complaint and then refer it to us for investigation, follows the process that was outlined, or they might send it to us anyway because there is some matter in it that they feel is important for us to look at. So yes, that we do get regularly complaints referred to us from IBAC, not in the police jurisdiction. I should just say we have no jurisdiction in relation to police, but certainly in relation to potential maladministration across the public sector broadly. So how it works, if they've sent it to us, it's usually because they don't want to deal with it themselves. So it's really for us to form a view as to whether we take this on or not. And usually we will at least begin the process of a preliminary investigation to see whether there is anything in it. But there's also a backwards and forwards process. So if they might refer something to us. Well, yes, the public example, thank you, Meg, at Operation Daintree, that started out as an ombudsman investigation. It then, if something reaches the threshold where it appears to involve corrupt conduct, we then refer it back to IBAC, and then it's really a matter for them to determine what to do with it. Sometimes they keep it themselves, as they did in Daintree. Sometimes they will send it back to us to continue. But really what it comes down to is very, very close communication and coordination, identifying who is best placed to deal with this. We have similar but different powers. IBAC has significantly more powers than I have. They have intrusive surveillance powers I don't have. So it also depends as well on which is the most appropriate agency to take it forward.
Okay. We will close with the final question that I'll put to you, Deborah, and that is, how do you maintain objectivity, independence and integrity during investigations that are at risk of being judged as politically motivated?
Oh, what a timely question. Look, the short answer to this is that I play with as straight as the bats. That's all you can do as ombudsman. And to some degree, the proof of the pudding is in the criticism I get from all sides of politics. So that's, I am not a political appointment, and I've been very clear about that. I recall saying so, in fact, in the foreword of the Red Shirts report, and indeed, not long after the Red Shirts report came out, I got a referral from the government we called the Blue Shirts investigation. So I think my record, when you look at this, I hope speaks for itself.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank our panelists today, our Victorian Ombudsman, Deborah Glass, Victorian Deputy Ombudsman, Megan Philpot, and Director of Investigations, Ros Wozniak, for joining us today. Do fill in the survey when that's available to you, and join us for the next in our behind the scenes series when we talk about the complaint handling process. So thank you for joining us and have a wonderful afternoon.